Today's speaker is Patrick Grenier, a historian, curator, and educator whose experience includes working at the Brooklyn Museum, Brick, Cooper Union, Snug Harbor Cultural Center, and the New Museum. From 2009 to 2016, he organized several exhibitions with George Way, including Dutch Treats and The Wick and the Stick. He developed new galleries dedicated to featuring 17th century Dutch and English fine and decorative arts from the Way collection. Grenier holds a bachelor's degree in art history from Pratt Institute and a master's in cultural history from New York University. Speaking on George Way, the collector you always wanted to know, I give you Patrick Grenier.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a pre-auction talk of highlights on the furniture and art from the estate of George Way, which is featured in this summer's Skinner European Auction of Furniture and Decorative Arts. I'm so pleased to be here, and I'm so pleased to have so many people have joined on this Zoom call today. There's over 300 extraordinary works from George's collection in the auction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about George, give you a little bit of background, and also talk a little bit about each, well, not each, but many of the objects that are in the collection. If there's time at the end, I'd be happy to answer some questions. So if you're familiar with Zoom, there's a little chat field at the bottom. You can just enter it at any time during the talk. And when I get through the slides, we'll take a look at that and see what kind of questions you guys have. After George's sudden passing in 2019, and based on my work with George over the past 10 years, I was invited by the estate to assist with the management of the collection. I'm so honored to have been asked to speak about George today and extend my thanks to Stuart Slawid, Senior Vice President of European Decorative Arts and Silver, for inviting me here. His team has worked really hard, and they've just done an amazing job inventorying George's collection and putting it online. And I hope that some of you, if you haven't already, have had a look at some of the items in the collection and in the auction. I'm also really excited to be here today. I'm happy to have any opportunity to talk about art, but I'm so happy to be able to talk about my good friend George, who I miss dearly. Years ago, when I graduated, I dreamed of working with passionate and knowledgeable colleagues in the field of art. And one of the people I met along the way was George. And he is the collector I always wanted to meet. George was eccentric, yes. George was obsessed, totally. Look at all of these chamber sticks. He also had a contagious curiosity, which was something that everybody loved about him. He was not arrogant. He studied history. He read intensely. He went to museums and he studied furniture. Sometimes he would bribe the guards at an opportunity to take a look at the underside of a drawer. He spent hours calling curators, writing letters to them, just to ask them a question about a subject matter or about the back of a painting. He even sent wood samples to the Department of Interior to find out more about the type of wood that was being used and whether or not he could determine if it was American or from some European location. Other investigations that George was involved in included writing to the Victoria and Albert Museum to learn more about a piece of furniture. He would write to local historic houses to learn more about the nature of a design or a pattern. He even wrote to curators at the Metropolitan Museum of Art to learn more about stamps that were initialed on the chairs, trying to determine if they were from the owner, trying to find out if they were possibly from the maker. He even had correspondence with the Queen of England, and on 2 occasions, they exchanged letters. He was a detective of 17th century art and furniture who scoured auction houses, antique shops, historic houses, museums, private collections, and if it was Saturday, George was at the flea market looking for treasures. Sometimes he'd even be out with friends for an evening for dinner. And in the corner, he would spot a wonderful cupboard such as this item, which is in the collection, was in the collection, is now in the auction, um, with these wonderful, elaborately carved geometric doors, um, the cup and cover stems at the top. We'll take a look at this a little bit later on as we go through the individual items. He was also notorious for avoiding shipping fees. Whenever possible, he would transport a 17th century English chair or a framed oil painting on the Staten Island ferry back to his one-bedroom apartment. Now, if you are fortunate enough to acquire an item from this auction, remember to thank George for being the trooper that he was and for tenderly carrying some of these wonderful treasures back to his one-bedroom apartment. Before we delve into the various lots in the auction, I do want to share a little bit of background on my relationship to the estate, which gives the collection some critical context. As Stuart indicated, I met George in 2009 while I was Director of Visual Arts at Snug Harbor Cultural Center on Staten Island. George called me to invite me to his apartment to coordinate the creation of a period room at Snug Harbor. We were planning for the 400th anniversary of Henry Hudson, and myself, being a longtime admirer of Dutch period rooms at the Brooklyn Museum, I was excited to learn about George's collection and was thrilled when he called me to invite me to his apartment to work on a project. Now, I've visited many collections during my 3 decades working in the arts, and there are many collectors who are so neurotic in their own very beautiful way, of course, but few have works prior to the 19th century. Upon my arrival at George's apartment, he opened the door and warmly welcomed me to his tiny little space. It took a moment for me to get my bearings as my eyes darted around the room from floor to ceiling, from wall to wall. There was 17th century furniture and art everywhere. There was little ensembles of cane chairs, the cupboard from the restaurant, paintings on the walls and the corners. There were even little miniatures covering surfaces. It was like a tiny little exhibition. And I wondered, I didn't even pay an admission fee to go in. Now, I'd heard rumors about eccentric collectors in New York City, but this was my first time. This was quite an extraordinary thing to see, all crammed into one tiny little apartment. It was just beautifully neurotic and just wonderful. Every furniture surface was just covered with more and more things. As I went around the apartment, I was just astonished by the number of paintings that were there and just the range of portraiture, genre paintings, the furniture. It just was endless and just a delight to see. So then George says, "Oh, I have more to show you." And I tried to leave the dining room where the tour was happening to hear George from down the hall as he called me. He says, "Come down, I want to show you more." As I'm trying to comb through the foyer to look at every little object that's there, I start making my way down the hallway, which of course was additionally lined by more and more paintings. As I turned the corner, I walked into George's bedroom, and there was that magnificent bed that was so legendary that I'd heard about. And it is quite magnificent. I really couldn't keep my eyes off of it. The extraordinary Royal Order of the Garter carved on the back headboard, the extraordinary carving, down to the detail of the lion and the dragon flanking, the hair on the lion's mane, the scales on the dragon. It's just really, really an exceptional piece, very museum quality piece. Yet there it is sitting right there in George's modest little apartment full of all these other treasures. It was quite an extraordinary moment for me. After a grand tour of the tiny George Way Palace, he and I had a fantastic conversation about the plan for the 17th century period room. George was bursting with ideas, and I quickly recognized that his knowledge and expertise was garnered from a combination of years of reading and study, but also a lot of time spent with the objects themselves and really understanding the front, the back, the making of it, the way things are put together. He was really fascinated by how artists worked and how they created things, and not just art historical or historical context. Of course, his ideas for the period room bounce from references of the Brooklyn Museum, which has the wonderful Schenck House, to the Met, and all the appropriate accessories that would be needed to put together a period room. And he was really tuned into the way that the visitor would experience this. So he was very keen on very specific details within the installation. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about this really extraordinary culminating period room that George created at historic Huguenot Street. In it, you can see a number of armchairs, decorative arts items, tobacco boxes. In the rear, you see some of the ceramic pieces, including the vase, which is in the Skinner auction. Many of the elements that George had collected over his 5 decades were all assembled here, almost like his little children, like a little family portrait. The catalog for this particular exhibition is still available. It's a really great read if you're interested in learning more about George and also about Huguenot Street and early Dutch settlers. Anyway, back to George Way and the Dutch exhibition. It was really simply terrific. It was filled with wonderful decorative items. George took time to create a little ensemble near the front of the room that featured small tobacco box, as if a sitter had just been there having a little cocktail and having a little bit of smoke. Attendance simply broke records. There was extraordinary attendance, wonderful public program. And with all of the things that were going on that year during the Henry Hudson celebration, even George's good friend, the Consul General of New York, Hugo Sheltema, came to the opening reception to open the exhibition, which was a wonderful treat, and said all kinds of flattering things about George, which was very deserved. Now, many people ask, how did this beautiful insanity start? Well, George told me this story about the origin of some of his collecting. He was 10 years old. They were on a family trip to Valley Forge. His father dropped him off near the visitor center to go find parking and said, wait here. George, on this hot summer day, decided he was going to go over to a tree and just get in the shade to cool off a little bit. As he was there, he was kicking in the dirt and he saw some little metal object. He wasn't sure what it was. He picked it up, he put it in his pocket. By then his parents were there and they said, come on, we're going into the visitor center. So he went in. While in the visitor center, he saw this display and he saw a Revolutionary War soldier and he saw the buttons and he realized, hey, I think that I just found a Revolutionary War button. And sure enough, that's what it was. And interestingly, many of the things that were in his apartment dated from the time of about the 17th century, but it was this one Revolutionary War button that started it all. Such an intimate, everyday object was a major source that just fueled decades and decades of collecting. Just the excitement of something 200 years old in your hands really, really just stimulated George and excited him. Later, in the 1970s, George's grandfather sadly passed away, but fortunately for George, he left some funds for him to make a research trip to England to visit some museums and historic houses. While in London, he encountered a dealer who was so impressed by the young autodidact's expertise in a Charles II armchair, he invited him home that evening for dinner. George got there and saw this wonderful collection of 17th century items and was just fascinated. And when he saw this ensemble collection in this one private home, he realized that was his goal. He was going to start this collection and really just gather all of these items that he wanted, period pieces that were going to be furniture, decorative arts items, paintings, works on paper. By 1981, George's reputation for identifying the merits of 17th century furniture had grown so widely, he was eventually hired by Christie's auction house in New York City as a consultant. And that same year, he acquired the legendary bed, which you see here. And it really was one of the early triumphs of George's collecting. And yes, he proudly slept in that bed each evening. George truly lived, breathed, and slept the 17th century. Indeed, a fridge and maybe a radio were about the only modern appliances George had in his home. He was named one of the top 100 collectors by Art and Antique magazine 3 years in a row. He was really thrilled when he was contacted by Pensbury Manor in the 1990s through 2000, where he had an extensive relationship with them to create several displays which focused on Charles II, which was an area that George had enormous expertise in. And Charles II was tied to Pensbury Manor because William Penn had a debt from the king that needed to be paid, and that land that became Pennsylvania was the payment. So William Penn, or Pensbury Manor, which I encourage you all to go visit, is a wonderful trip through 18th and 17th century America. George was so excited by the feedback that he had gotten from curators and collectors during this relationship that he had developed with Pensbury Manor. Word spread. Before he knew it, he was getting invitations from the Folger Shakespeare Library in DC. The Philadelphia Museum of Art contacted him. Even the Albany Institute of History and Art was in touch with him to learn more about the collection. He also contributed to numerous articles on material culture. Now, he was so excited about sharing so much of his knowledge, he actually started his own antique column in the local paper, the Staten Island Advance. And there he would write about many of the excursions and treasures and hunts that he would go on, as well as what was a fake and how could you tell a real artifact. It was really a wonderful series of articles that went on for over 30 years. In fact, did I mention Oprah? Yes, George was also on Oprah for a focus on special collections and people who just had that bug, that bite, that fire in their belly to collect. He was also, in 2007, honored by then Mayor Bloomberg for his contributions to the cultural community. And this prestigious evening was an award ceremony where he shared the stage with none other than then director of the Metropolitan, Philippe de Montebello. Over the years of working with George, we created several really wonderful exhibitions that highlighted different areas of his collecting. Here we have a boarded box collection, which featured many of the slant top boxes, some of these boarded boxes, Bible boxes, as well as additional furniture that shared some of the decorative arts motif. There was a wonderful exhibition that George had conceived of, where he created a kind of exhibition design that was a constellation of brass objects throughout the gallery called the Wick and the Stick. We also worked together on creating these ensembles. George would conceive of these little almost storytelling vignettes of paintings to decorative arts, to letters, to furniture, and then all of the relationship in between. Here's a wonderful collection presented of different Charles the Furniture related items. There's a wonderful painting of Charles in the upper left there. Here's another wonderful ensemble. This was also part of the Wick and the Stick. Here we see a wonderful turned back ball chair with a solid seat. There's a Dutch prayer book in the foreground, wonderful little snuff box, scissor snuffers, of course, to go with the candle. And then it's a bit of an oblique angle, but there's a genre painting in the upper left corner, which also related to some of the different items in the display. Here's a wonderful presentation that was done at the Orangetown Museum. You can see George's focus here was on creating a hearth with all of the accessories, including a coiffeur, beautiful brass coiffeur, agricultural references. There was a wonderful painting that George had, which is in the auction, of chickens and hens. Another wonderful exhibition featured in the Loyal to the Crown, which was a celebration of Charles I and Charles II, featured a range of portraits and decorative arts items from George's collection. Yes, George was certainly the collector I always wanted to know. One additional note that I also want to make about George is he was really passionate about educating young people. Whenever he had exhibitions, he would stroll in and he would talk to all the young people that were there, students and so forth. He was very passionate about this. And I do want to note that some of the proceeds of the auction will be going towards establishing a fund in George's name, a cultural organization on Staten Island that will commemorate this passion for educating youth. So if you're fortunate enough to join the auction and win something, thank you for making a contribution for young scholars who will be studying art and furniture in George's name. Lastly, I just want to say, what a big personality and what a huge appetite George had for knowledge and art and culture. He was really my go-to expert for 17th century Dutch and Flemish and English things. Sadly, he passed away last year quite suddenly. I guess God called him to the great museum in the sky. So I lost a collector that I always wanted to know, but also a dear friend. And he was the one I always wanted to meet. And I'm so grateful that I did. Let's delve now into some of the highlights of the Skinner European Furniture and Decorative Arts auction.